1916 Joliet. Steel rails, coal smoke, autumn wind off the prairie. 12 spent shell casings rest in a perfect circle where they shouldn't be. Footprints approach the rail switch and vanish mid-stride. If no one returned by dawn, who threw the lever at 2:30? The Chicago and Alton Yard stretched along the Des Plaines River where the main line split toward Kansas City and St. Louis. Switch number 7 controlled the ladder tracks feeding into the roundhouse. Every yardman knew its geometry. The lever stood 4 feet tall, painted yellow, weighted to resist casual movement. Throwing it required both hands and a full body pull. The switch tongue moved 6 inches to redirect tonnage. Between the rails lay crushed limestone ballast and creosote ties stamped with production dates. Nothing grew there. Nothing hid there. Sight lines ran clean for 200 yards in every direction. On the evening of October 3rd, the scout arrived for the midnight inspection. His name appears in the yard ledger as Thomas Cray, age 16, employed 3 months. Scouts walked the active trackage checking for loose bolts, cracked fish plates, debris on the rails. They carried a coal oil lantern, a crescent wrench, a notebook with carbon duplicates. Thomas signed in at the foreman's shack at 11:40. The foreman noted clear skies, temperature near 50, no wind. Thomas took the standard route clockwise from the main gate. He would reach switch 7 around midnight if he kept pace. The next entry came from the night watchman, who walked the perimeter fence every 2 hours. At 1:15, he passed the east end of the yard and saw the lantern burning near switch 7. He remembered because the light sat motionless on the ballast instead of swinging as a man walked. He assumed Thomas had stopped to tighten something. The watchman continued his round. When he returned at 3:15, the lantern still burned in the same spot, but Thomas was gone. The watchman approached and found the lantern upright between 2 ties, wick trimmed, glass chimney intact, fuel reservoir half full. The crescent wrench lay beside it. The notebook sat open to a blank page, pencil resting in the spine fold, as if someone had paused mid-sentence. The lunch pail stood 10 feet away on the far side of the switch, lid closed. The lever had been thrown. The switch tongue pointed toward the St. Louis line, though no train was scheduled on that route until morning. No one had authority to move it during inspection hours. The foreman kept the master key to the switch lock and it hung on its nail in the shack. Then the watchman saw the shell casings, 12 of them arranged in a wide circle around the base of the lever. They looked freshly spent. Brass, still bright. No rust or grime. Each casing lay on its side pointing outward like the spokes of a wheel. They were .30-06 rifle rounds, military surplus, common enough in that year. But no one carried a rifle on yard duty, and no hunter would fire into a rail yard after midnight. The watchman counted them twice. 12 exactly. He did not touch them. He walked quickly back to the shack and rang the emergency bell. By 4 in the morning, 8 yardmen had gathered at switch 7. They brought additional lanterns and searched the ballast stone by stone. They found no blood, no torn clothing, no spent primers or powder residue beyond the 12 casings. They found no footprints in the thin dust that had settled on the ties after the previous day's shunting operations. Thomas had approached the switch from the south. His boot prints showed clearly in that dust for 30 paces. Then they stopped. The last print appeared 2 strides from the lever, weight on the ball of the foot as if he had been walking normally. No scuff marks, no drag marks, no sign of struggle. The prints simply ended. The foreman examined the lunch pail. He opened the lid. Inside, he found a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, an apple, a tin cup. All items were dry, yet the weather ledger recorded rain between midnight and 2 in the morning, light but persistent. The watchman confirmed it. He had worn his slicker on the 1:15 round. The ground showed damp patches, the ties glistened under lantern light. Pooled water stood in the low spots along the fence. But the lunch pail sat uncovered on open ballast, and nothing inside had gotten wet. The wax paper showed no water spots. The apple skin was dusty, not rinsed. At dawn, the foreman sent 2 men to Thomas's boarding house 3 blocks west of the yard. The landlady said he had left at 11 as usual. He wore his canvas work jacket and cloth cap. He carried his lunch and his notebook. He said nothing unusual. He had paid his rent on time and kept to himself. The men walked back along the route Thomas would have taken. They found nothing. No one along Water Street or Madison had heard anything strange during the night. The grocer who stayed open late cleaning his shop had watched the clock tower and noticed nothing between 11:30 and 1. The railroad sent a telegraph to the Joliet police at 7 in the morning. 2 officers arrived by 8 and walked the scene. They noted the casings, the lunch pail, the thrown switch. They asked about enemies. The foreman said Thomas was quiet, competent, without friction. The officers asked about gambling debts or romantic trouble. The foreman said he knew of none. They examined the switch mechanism. It moved smoothly, recently oiled, no damage. They measured the distance from the last footprint to the lever. 6 feet 4 inches. A man could cover that in 2 strides, but there were no prints for those strides. One officer suggested Thomas had backed away and left by the same path he came, deliberately stepping in his own tracks. The other officer pointed out that backing up leaves a different impression: weight on the heel, shorter stride. These prints showed forward motion, cut off clean. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered at the yard gate. Word spread through the rail district. Switching accidents happened often enough. Men crushed between couplers, fingers lost to slack chains, but men did not vanish from open ground with lanterns burning and tools laid out neat. The foreman closed the gate and posted guards. He ordered the casings collected and placed in a canvas bag. He had the lunch pail and notebook taken to the yard office. He left the lantern burning exactly where it sat. He wanted Thomas to see it if he came back confused or injured from somewhere beyond the fence. The dog arrived at first light on the morning of October 4th, 30 hours after Thomas disappeared. It was a rail yard mutt, no particular breed, friendly with the yardmen who fed it scraps. It came trotting down the main line from the north, dragging something. One of the guards saw it and called the foreman. The dog carried a leash in its mouth, a standard leather strap with a brass clip, but the leash was knotted tight around the dog's own muzzle, looped twice, cinched so the animal could barely pant. The dog had not done this to itself. Someone had tied it deliberately, carefully, then let it go. The foreman cut the knot and freed the dog. It did not belong to Thomas. Thomas had no dog. The leash showed no name stamp or tag. It was worn but serviceable, the kind sold in dry goods stores. The knot was a bowline, neat and symmetrical, the sort a sailor or a scout might tie. The foreman kept the leash. He gave the dog water. It stayed near the yard office and would not go back toward the northern tracks. That afternoon, the railroad brought in a search crew from the regional office in Chicago. 6 men trained in accident recovery and right-of-way inspection. They worked in pairs, walking transects 50 yards wide from the yard boundary, north to the bridge and south to the coal fields. They carried notebooks and sketched every anomaly. They found old couplers, broken brake shoes, lengths of chain, a rotted tarpaulin. They found no trace of Thomas Cray. They walked the river bank where the yard abutted the Des Plaines. The water ran shallow and clear. They saw no clothing, no disturbance in the mud. They checked the roundhouse, the coaling tower, the water tank, the repair sheds. They climbed the signal gantry and examined the sight lines. At dusk, they reported to the foreman. Nothing. The police returned on the morning of October 5th with a sergeant and a man who had worked bloodhound searches downstate. The dog was old and moved slowly, but its nose still worked. They gave it Thomas's cap, which the landlady had provided. The dog circled the yard office, walked directly to switch 7, sat down beside the lever, and refused to move. The handler tried coaxing it toward the perimeter, toward the river, back along the approach path. The dog would not leave the switch. It whined once, low and continuous, then lay down with its head on its paws. After an hour, the handler gave up. He said the scent was too strong right there, and the dog could not sort it from background. Or the scent ended right there and the dog knew it. That evening, the foreman sat in his office reviewing the yard ledger. He kept a daily log of crew assignments, safety drills, inspection schedules, equipment movement. He was turning back through September when he found the entry for October 4th. It read, Safety drill, switch 7, 2 p.m. T. Cray initials drill completion. The entry was written in his own hand. He recognized his penmanship, the way he formed the capital letters, the spacing. But October 4th had been the day after Thomas disappeared, and no drill had occurred. The foreman had spent that entire day managing the search. He had not written any entry for October 4th. He checked the ink. It looked fresh, the same bottle he used daily, but the page showed no bleed-through, no smudge, as if it had dried long ago. The timestamp said 2 in the afternoon. Thomas had vanished 38 hours before that time. Yet there were his initials, tidy and clear, next to the foreman's handwriting that confirmed completion. The foreman brought the ledger to the police. The sergeant examined it under lamplight. He agreed the handwriting matched the foreman's earlier entries. He asked if anyone else had access to the log. The foreman said no. It stayed locked in his desk drawer. He asked if anyone could have copied the foreman's writing. The foreman said perhaps, but why bother? And how would they know to write October 4th before it happened? The sergeant had no answer. He copied the page into his own notes and returned the ledger. On the morning of October 6th, 72 hours after the disappearance, a light rain began before dawn. The foreman walked to switch 7 as he had every morning since. The lantern had finally burned out, fuel exhausted. The lever stood as it had been found, thrown toward St. Louis. He intended to reset it, but as he approached, the lever moved. It swung smoothly through its arc without sound, without resistance, and clicked into the Kansas City position. No one stood near it. No wind blew strong enough to shift the weighted mechanism. The foreman stepped back. He watched for 5 minutes. The lever did not move again. He walked to the mechanism housing and checked for mechanical failure, a broken spring or slipped pawl. Everything sat correct and tight. He threw the lever himself. It required full effort as always. He let go. It stayed where he put it. He reset it to Kansas City and left it there. The story reached the newspaper on October 7th. The Joliet Herald ran a front-page notice under the headline, "Rail Scout Missing, Switch Moves Itself. Police Baffled." The article noted the casings, the lunch pail, the thrown lever, the ledger entry. It mentioned the dog with the leash. It did not speculate. Newspapers rarely did in that year. They reported facts and left conclusions to the reader. But letters arrived at the Herald office within days. A rail worker from Lockport wrote that switches had been known to freeze in winter and spring loose when ice melted inside the mechanism. But October was too early for ice. A woman from Plainfield wrote that her brother had worked the Alton yards in the 90s and once saw a lever throw itself during an electrical storm, current traveling through the rails. But the weather on October 3rd had been calm and dry until midnight. A veteran from Channahon wrote that artillery shells sometimes sat unexploded for years, then cooked off in the sun. But these were spent casings, already fired, no primers left to ignite. The railroad suspended operations through Switch 7 on October 8th, while a company engineer examined the mechanism in detail. He disassembled the throw lever, the switch rod, the point locks. He found everything in standard condition. The pivot pins showed normal wear. The spring pack held correct tension. The rail clamps gripped tight. He reassembled it, tested it 20 times, and certified it operational. He wrote in his report that the switch was mechanically sound and any uncommanded movement must have resulted from external force or witness error. He did not explain what external force could move a weighted lever strong enough to redirect a freight consist. By the second week of October, the police had interviewed 43 people: yardmen, switchmen, engineers, firemen, the boarding house landlady, neighbors along Water Street, the night clerk at the depot, the telegraph operator, the coal yard supervisor. No one had seen Thomas Cray after 11:40 on October 3rd. No one had heard gunfire, shouts, or unusual sounds. The police checked passenger manifests for trains leaving Joliet on the 3rd and 4th. Thomas's name appeared nowhere. They checked hospitals in Joliet, Chicago, and Aurora. No unidentified patients. They sent descriptions to police departments in adjacent counties. No matches. The sergeant filed a report listing Thomas as missing under unknown circumstances and noted that further investigation would continue pending new evidence. The foreman kept the yard operating, but the men moved differently around Switch 7. They threw it when necessary, but they did not linger. They finished their tasks and walked away. No one volunteered for the midnight inspection route. The foreman split it between two men who worked together and carried pistols, though regulations discouraged firearms on active trackage. The men reported nothing unusual, but they hurried through that section. The dog that had arrived with the knotted leash stayed near the yard office and would not approach the switch. If someone carried it past the roundhouse, it struggled free and ran back. In late October, a geologist from the Illinois State Survey visited the yard as part of a separate project mapping subsurface coal seams. He had worked in the Joliet area for 2 years and knew the local strata. When he heard about the missing scout, he asked to see Switch 7. The foreman walked him to the site. The geologist examined the ballast, knelt, and brushed aside surface stones. He dug down 6 inches with a trowel and studied the soil. He said the yard sat on glacial till deposited 10,000 years earlier. Dense clay mixed with sand and gravel, compacted hard. No voids, no sinkholes, no limestone solution features. The nearest cave systems lay 30 miles south. He said a man could not sink into this ground. Even if he fell into a hidden shaft, it would have been dug deliberately and someone would remember it. The foreman thanked him. The geologist paused before leaving and mentioned that surveyors in the 1860s had reported compass anomalies along the Des Plaines near this location, needles swinging 10 degrees off true north, then correcting. Old maps marked the area with a note about magnetic disturbance. No one had investigated further because the rail line worked fine and compasses were not critical for yard operations. A theory circulated among the yardmen that Thomas had been struck by a train. Switch 7 sat on an active line. Perhaps he had stepped onto the main track, been hit and dragged. But the theory collapsed under scrutiny. No trains had passed through that section between 11:40 and 3:15. The dispatcher confirmed it from his logs. The only consists in the yard that night were stationary, parked on repair tracks half a mile away. Even if a locomotive had moved without authorization, it would have left marks on the ballast, damage to the switch mechanism, blood on the rails. The search crews had inspected every foot of iron in both directions. Nothing. Another theory suggested Thomas had fled voluntarily. Perhaps he owed money, faced trouble, wanted to disappear. But he had no debts the police could find. His boarding house room held his belongings, his saved wages, a letter from his mother in Pennsylvania. He had not packed. He had not withdrawn funds from the postal savings account. His behavior before the disappearance showed no distress. The landlady said he had seemed content, even pleased to have steady work. And voluntary flight did not explain the casings, the lunch pail dry after rain, the ledger entry, the switch moving itself, the dog with the leash. A third theory emerged from older yardmen who had worked the line since the previous century. They spoke carefully, often at night, away from the foreman's hearing. They said the Alton tracks crossed old ground. Before the railroad came through in the 1850s, this had been prairie, then briefly a camp for workers building the Illinois and Michigan Canal. Before that, Potawatomi hunting routes. The yardmen said sometimes the land remembered what had been taken from it. They did not elaborate. When pressed, they changed the subject or walked away. The foreman dismissed this as superstition, but he noticed the men left tobacco near Switch 7, small offerings placed on ties when no one watched. In early November, the foreman received a letter from Thomas's mother. She had traveled from Pennsylvania by train and wished to see where her son had last been. The foreman met her at the depot. She was a small woman, perhaps 50, dressed in black, carrying a cloth bag. She asked few questions. The foreman walked her to Switch 7 in daylight with 2 yardmen accompanying. She stood silent for several minutes, looking at the ballast, the lever, the rails splitting toward distant horizons. She asked if he had suffered. The foreman said honestly that he did not know, but there was no evidence of suffering. She asked if the search would continue. He said yes, though he did not know where else to look. She opened her cloth bag and removed a small framed photograph of Thomas. She asked if she could place it somewhere he might see it if he returned. The foreman said she could leave it in the yard office. She thanked him. Before leaving, she knelt and touched the ballast near the last footprint. Her hand came away dusty, and she did not brush it off. The railroad company posted a reward in mid-November, $50 for information leading to Thomas Cray or explaining his disappearance. The amount was significant, 2 months' wages for a yard worker. Tips arrived daily. A farmer north of Joliet reported a young man matching the description walking the roadside on October 4th. Police investigated and found the man worked at a grain elevator and had never been to the rail yard. A woman in Lockport claimed her neighbor kept someone locked in a shed. Police checked and found only tools and stored potatoes. A child said he had seen a ghost near the river at night. Police thanked him and moved on. None of the tips led anywhere. Winter came early that year. By Thanksgiving, the ground had frozen and snow began to accumulate. The foreman ordered cinders spread on the walkways and kept the switch mechanisms oiled to prevent freezing. Work continued, but the yard felt different. Men finished their shifts quickly and left. The night crew shrank to a skeleton staff. No one wanted the midnight inspection. The foreman took it himself twice a week, walking fast, lantern swinging, eyes forward. On the evening of December 9th, 9 weeks after Thomas disappeared, the night watchman heard a sound near switch 7. He described it later as rhythmic, like footsteps on gravel, deliberate and measured. He approached with his lantern. The sound stopped. He searched the area and found nothing. But on the ballast near the lever, he saw the 12 shell casings arranged again in a circle, pointing outward. He was certain they had been collected weeks earlier, placed in a canvas bag stored in the yard office. He ran to the office and checked the bag. It hung on its nail. He opened it. Empty. He returned to the switch with 2 other men. The casings remained in their circle. The men counted them. 12 exactly. Same caliber, same condition, brass bright as if freshly spent. The foreman was summoned from home. He arrived within the hour, studied the casings, touched none of them. He ordered them left in place in the area cordoned. The police came at first light. The sergeant examined the casings and compared them to the sketches made in October. Same arrangement, same spoke pattern, each casing pointing outward. He asked if they could be different casings, a prank or copycat display. The foreman said the original casings had been marked with notches before storage. These casings bore the same notches. Identical placement. The sergeant had no explanation. He collected them again, this time placing them in a locked box in his own office. The railroad sent a senior investigator from Chicago the following week. He was a man in his 60s who had worked for the company since before the turn of the century. He had investigated dozens of yard accidents, sabotage attempts, and personnel incidents. He spent 3 days in Joliet, reviewing every document, interviewing every witness, walking every transect. He examined the ledger entry, the lunch pail, the leash. He studied the casings in the police lockbox. He tested the switch mechanism himself. On his last evening, he sat with the foreman in the yard office and smoked a pipe. He said he had seen men crushed, drowned, burned, frozen, electrocuted, shot, and struck by rolling stock. He had seen men steal, fight, and desert. He had never seen anything like this. He said the company would keep the case open, but without new evidence there was nothing more to do. He advised the foreman to maintain normal operations and document anything unusual. Then he boarded the evening train back to Chicago. Christmas passed quietly. The yard ran on reduced schedule. A few men left gifts at switch 7, small items wrapped in paper. The foreman let them remain. No one touched them. By New Year, they had been covered by snow. The winter was hard that year. Temperatures below 0 for weeks. The Des Plaines froze solid. Coal trains ran continuously feeding the city's furnaces. The yard worked around the clock, and there was no time for mysteries. In late February, a thaw came sudden and early. Ice on the river cracked and shifted. Snowmelt pooled in the yard. The foreman ordered drainage ditches cleared. On the last day of the month, a yardman working near switch 7 called out. The foreman came running. The yardman pointed to the ballast. Melted snow had pooled in a depression, and when the water drained, it left a shape in the dirt. An outline like a human figure lying on its side, arms extended, legs together. The shape measured roughly 5.5 feet long. It had formed naturally as silt settled after the water receded, but the placement was exact. The head of the figure lay where Thomas's last footprint had ended. The arms reached toward the lever. The foreman stood over it for a long time. Then he fetched a shovel and filled it in. March brought inspectors from the Interstate Commerce Commission reviewing rail safety practices across the Midwest. They visited Joliet as part of a scheduled audit. When they learned about the missing scout, they requested all documentation. The foreman provided copies of the police reports, the search logs, the witness statements, the ledger pages. The inspectors read through everything, asked technical questions about yard procedures, and made notes. They found no safety violations. They commented that the case was peculiar, but outside their jurisdiction. They recommended the railroad company maintain training standards and continue proper documentation. They left on the afternoon train. Spring arrived fully in April. The yard greened at its edges where grass pushed through cinders. Freight traffic increased with the warmer weather. New scouts were hired, including 2 young men from downstate who knew nothing about Thomas Cray until the older yardmen told them. The story had become part of the yard's oral history, repeated during night shifts and meal breaks. Details varied in the telling. Some said 12 casings, others said 13. Some said the dog had been Thomas's. Others said it belonged to no one. Some said the switch had moved once. Others claimed it moved nightly for weeks. The foreman corrected the facts when he heard them mangled, but he could not control the story once it left his hearing. On a warm evening in late May, the foreman was closing the yard office when he noticed a man standing near switch 7. The man wore a dark coat and hat, hands in pockets, watching the rails. The foreman called out. The man turned and walked toward the fence line. The foreman followed, but the man moved quickly, and by the time the foreman reached the fence, the man had vanished into the streets beyond the yard boundary. The foreman could not describe him clearly. Average height, average build, nothing distinctive. He dismissed it as a curious passerby. But when he returned to the office, he found the door ajar, though he had locked it. Inside, on his desk, lay a single sheet of paper. It was a telegraph message form, standard Western Union stock, dated October 3, 1916, time-stamped 4:17 in the morning. The message read, "Arrive safe. Will explain when I return. T.C." The receiving station was listed as Joliet Depot. The sending station was blank. The foreman checked with the depot telegraph operator the next morning. The operator had no record of receiving such a message. He checked his logs back to October. Nothing. The foreman kept the paper in his desk drawer with the other inexplicable items. Summer came hot and still. The yard baked under the sun. Tar bubbled between ties. Mirages shimmered on distant tracks. The foreman assigned men to water the ballast to keep dust down. On one of these watering details, a young scout noticed something strange about the mile markers along the fence. The markers were wooden posts set every quarter mile with stenciled numbers indicating distance from the Chicago terminal. The scout said the numbers near switch 7 were wrong. The foreman checked them personally. The posts read correctly in sequence heading north and south except for one. The post nearest switch 7 read 42 instead of 38. The foreman knew every marker by heart. That post had always read 38. He examined it closely. The paint looked fresh but not new. The stencil matched the standard railroad template. The wood showed normal weathering. He could not determine when the number had changed or who had changed it. He ordered it repainted to 38. The work crew did so that afternoon. The next morning the post read 42 again. The foreman reported the marker anomaly to the regional office. An inspector came down from Chicago, measured the actual distance from the terminal using a surveyor's chain, and confirmed the post should read 38. The inspector examined the post and found no evidence of tampering. He suggested vandalism or a mental trick, the mind seeing what it expected rather than what was there. But the foreman had photographs from the previous year showing the post marked 38. He showed them to the inspector. The inspector had no explanation. He filed a report noting a discrepancy and recommended leaving the post as is to avoid wasting paint. The foreman left it reading 42, though it troubled him every time he passed. In August, the police sergeant retired. His replacement was a younger man who reviewed old cases and decided to close the Thomas Cray file. He sent a letter to the foreman stating that after 10 months without leads or evidence, the department considered further investigation unproductive. The case would remain open technically, but no active work would continue. The foreman understood. He wrote a final summary for the railroad company noting the same conclusion. Thomas Cray had disappeared without explanation. All reasonable searches had been exhausted. No evidence suggested foul play or accident, and the company had fulfilled its obligations. He filed the summary and locked the case folder in his cabinet. Life in the yard returned to routine as much as it could. Trains came and went. Scouts did their inspections. Switch 7 operated normally. The foreman aged into the role, hair graying, back stiffening, but his memory stayed sharp. He never forgot that October night. He never stopped checking the ballast near the lever even though years passed and seasons turned and the ground gave up nothing. The foreman retired in 1924 after 30 years with the company. On his last day, he walked to Switch 7 alone and stood where Thomas's footprints had ended. The rails stretched in both directions, steel singing faintly in the heat. He thought about the casings, the lunch pail, the ledger entry, the telegraph message, the mile marker, the shape in the melted snow. He thought about the facts that lined up clean as geometry, and the gaps that made no sense. He did not believe in ghosts or magic. He believed in steel and stone and the weight of things, but he also knew that believing and knowing were different, and some questions wore down a man not by lacking answers, but by having too many answers that canceled each other out. He placed his hand on the lever one last time. It felt solid and real, iron warm from the sun, mechanism smooth and oiled. He threw it toward St. Louis, then back to Kansas City. It moved exactly as it should. He nodded once and walked back to the office. He did not look back. He collected his final pay, shook hands with the men, and left the yard. He never returned. In the years after stories continued to circulate, yardmen claimed to hear footsteps near Switch 7 on October nights. Others said they saw a figure in a canvas jacket standing between the rails at dawn. A few reported finding objects that should not be there. A crescent wrench, a cloth cap, shell casings arranged in patterns. Each time the foreman's successors investigated and found nothing or found objects that matched the descriptions, but had ordinary explanations. The stories never stopped entirely. They wove into the fabric of the yard, one more layer of history pressed into ballast and creosote. The railroad rebuilt the yard in the 1930s, modernized signals, replaced switches, paved access roads. Switch 7 was dismantled and replaced with a newer mechanism designated Switch 12. The old lever and rails were scrapped. The ballast was graded and fresh stone laid down. But the stories did not disappear with the physical changes. They adapted, transferred to the new switch, carried forward by men who had heard them from men who had been there. The casings remained in the police lockbox until 1941, when the department cleared old evidence to make room during wartime material shortages. The brass was turned in for recycling. The ledger with the October 4th entry stayed in railroad company archives until the 1950s, when paper records were condensed, and many were destroyed. No one knows what became of the lunch pail or the leash or the telegraph message. They vanished into the same silence that took Thomas Cray. What pulled a 16-year-old scout between 2 points everyone could name? And why did 12 shells mark the spot like hours on a clock face that never moved forward? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.